Welcome to episode 3 of the A Storm of Swords reread. In today's video, we'll be doing Catelyn 1, A Storm of Swords. Now, I think Catelyn 1, especially in this book and previous books, kind of fall into the same trap. Now, don't get me wrong. I love Catelyn's POV. She is my favorite, but I do have to look at, it kind of feels like every single point of view that she has to open a book is, I would say, some of the meh of especially her plot lines, because a lot of the times they feel like they are reiterating what we know from the last book. They serve as the catch-up chapter. And especially when you think about how we start this book off, where it's Jaime's storyline, we're now also seeing the flip side of that with Catelyn. So not only is Catelyn's chapter kind of retreading what we just learned about Jaime's escape, it also is trying to set up the mood and the tone for the rest of her storyline, and that's kind of the way I feel like she usually is in every book. And so when I look at these early chapters, Catelyn is kind of like the stereotypical what I expect from George's like early first chapters for some of these characters. As we're going to follow Catelyn as she has released Jaime, she's now getting put into like kind of captivity, but not really, and her trying to rationalize through what she's done. And also some very interesting stuff about Lysa comes out in this chapter. Mainly, I would say, to set up what we're going to see with her storyline in Littlefinger and Sansa's storyline later on. But we start on page 21. Sir Dremmond Grell, who has served House Tully all his life, looks at her with embarrassment and discomfort, having watched her grow from a child into a mother of a king, and now seeing her as a traitor. With Edmure gone, he has been left to judge her actions, bringing, I really don't know how to pronounce this name, but Utherdis Wayne with him for support. As the two men hesitate, uneasy and unsure how to begin, their loyalty to her family clashing with her crime. Because this is the problem. How do you even deal with Catelyn right now? She is one of the most influential, maybe not influential, maybe that's a bad word, but she's one of the most known people. She has a lot of popularity in terms of being the mother of the current king. She grew up at Riverrun, the current lord who's about to die. Most people just already say Edmure is the lord, but she is still, the eldest daughter. It is one of those weird things where it's like, how do you go about putting someone in prison or captivity or punishing them? What do you even do? It's a very uncomfortable situation. It kind of feels like if you've ever been at a job and say that you have a friend you're working with, and, let's say you have seniority over them, you have to give them some sort of like punishment or scolding because maybe they screwed up something. That's kind of how this chapter reads with these two with Catelyn. Catelyn sees the shame and conflict in them and feels the weight of what she has done to those who have served her father so faithfully. They speak gently of her sons and her grief, suggesting her actions came from a mother's madness. And this is the way a lot of people are going to brush it off, is that Catelyn was not acting in her own mind. She was acting out of grief and madness. And in reality, Catelyn's going to deny that, but truthfully, that is kind of what happened. The reason Catelyn frees Jaime is based upon the fact that she's lost her husband, she's about to lose her father, she's just gotten the news that both of her sons were allegedly killed by Theon, nobody knows what's happening with Arya, and Sansa is a prisoner. So at this point, it feels like for Catelyn, she's lost all of her family besides Robb and like Edmure and the Blackfish, of course. But in terms of like her children, she was very much motivated by grief to do that trade. So in a lot of ways, Catelyn is not really like accepting that. Like she is accepting that she did these actions, but she really did it out of emotion. It was not based upon logic, how she kind of views that situation. Catelyn admits it was treason and insists it was her decision alone. She warns that if she is not punished, others will believe they were involved. Accepting responsibility, she declares she will take Jaime's place in chains if that is what justice demands. Catelyn doesn't want anyone else held responsible. She doesn't want people to be imprisoned because they did their job badly or something. She wants all the blame to be placed on her because in reality it was her decision. Now, in a lot of ways, Catelyn didn't really think about what was going to follow next. She is putting Brienne's life at stake for something that probably will not be able to succeed because Edmure is going to send people after Jaime, obviously. So I don't really think she was thinking all the things through. because she's trying to just say, oh, well, I'm responsible for everything, but her actions do have ripples. Her releasing Jaime is what is going to allow the Red Wedding to happen. So I do think that Catelyn, because she's been driven by emotion, she's not thinking about this situation rationally, which is so fascinating because A Clash of Kings, in a lot of ways, is about her thinking about things rationally, especially with her being involved in the conflict with Stannis and Renly. She was like our voice of reason. As we get into page 28, the idea of placing her in chains shocks Sir Desmond, who cannot accept such treatment for her, and Utherdis suggests a gentler punishment, confinement to her chambers to pray for her sons. Sir Desmond obviously agrees she should be confined, proposing maybe a tower cell, but Catelyn requests instead to stay in her father's chamber so she can be with him in his final days. Sir Desmond allows it, restricting her movement to those chambers and the sept. And to be honest, Catelyn's getting off pretty light for this, but to be honest, what were they going to do? Like, for these men, it's probably just like, okay, let's just have her to where she can't escape, she can't cause any more problems, and Robb and Edmure can deal with this whole situation because they don't have the power to do anything like that. And it's just very uncomfortable for them. They're just trying to look for the easiest solution that causes the least amount of problems, and they can just get out of there. It's very uncomfortable for these men, and Catelyn knows that. She's trying to help them out, at least in that regard, which is, I would say, nice of her. But another thing that Catelyn thinks about is how these men are now addressing Edmure as basically the new lord. All of them have basically given up on Hoster because he's going to die very shortly. And Catelyn, just at this point, she's given up correcting people because she also is accepting that while he is still living, he's not going to live for much longer. She offers her word that she will not attempt escape even if guards are placed on her. Sir Desmond leaves relieved but troubled, while Utherdis lingers. He tells her Robin Ryger has been sent to capture Jaime or kill him if necessary. Catelyn is not surprised and silently prays for Brienne's success. I do think it's interesting when you look at how the chapters were structured that George started with Jaime, because something like this should have some tension for Catelyn, but given we actually already know what happened in the fact that they were defeated, Brienne and Jaime and Cleos got away, I do think, like, I wonder why George decided to go with Jaime before Catelyn. Now, I think Jaime's chapter is much more exciting. I think it's a better opening chapter than I would say most opening chapters usually are for George R.R. Martin's books, but I'd love to know that. If you're watching this, put down in the comments, why do you think George went with Jaime's chapter over Catelyn's when they're following the same plot line? And I do think, like, narratively, it almost makes more sense to place Catelyn's chapter first, but I'd love to know what you guys think about that. But Catelyn realizes she's done all she can do and now must rely on hope. Her belongings are moved to her father's chambers where she was born, as Lord Hoster Tully lies nearby, relocated to a room where he can look out over the rivers he loved. Catelyn stands on the balcony, watching the river for any sign of Sir Robin's return, but seeing nothing, she feels relief and returns to sit with her father. She is unsure if he knows she is there, but finds comfort in his presence. She wonders what he would think of her actions, whether he would understand or condemn her. And knowing all I know about Hoster Tully, he would most definitely condemn her for these actions. And like we talked about a lot in A Clash of Kings, there's a lot that builds up to why she frees Jaime, but it is this reflection. It is, for me, what's so interesting about this chapter and Catelyn's storyline overall is all of the actions that Catelyn could do are now done. Everything that she's done in the last chapter has now set in motion what's going to happen. She cannot now stop the Red Wedding because the Battle of the Blackwater's already happened. The Lannisters are victorious, their power is growing, and Catelyn at the same time has all but screwed the Starks by releasing Jaime. Jaime, in a lot of ways, him being a captive, was Robb's shield. Now she's going to have to sit on that. People are going to judge her. She's going to be viewed very differently. She as a person is going to become a lot more depressed and bitter, and she was already building towards that by the end of the last book. But now, because of, really, I would say Rickon and Bran's death, that has been the catalyst for everything to really fall apart for her. Now, again, when I say Bran and Rickon's death, I mean from Catelyn's point of view, now that they're actually dead. Getting into page 29, the room carries a heavy, clinging smell of death that reminds Catelyn of her lost sons, Bran and Rickon, and deepens her grief for them and for Ned. You could also say, Hoster obviously is going to die soon as well, but even if you want to look at more foreshadowing, the fact that Catelyn is going to die and then she's going to come back as like this fire white or undead creature, maybe. So I think that's interesting as well. It's just a little bit of that nice foreshadowing there. She reflects on the cruelty of losing a child, speaking softly as she sits with her father, as Lord Hoster then suddenly wakes up and calls out for Tansy, not recognizing her. Catelyn corrects him but realizes he does not know who she is. The unfamiliar name unsettles her, making her wonder if there was another woman in his life. And at this point, that would obviously be where I would go if I was Catelyn as well, because you also have to think about when Hoster wakes up. It's when Catelyn is speaking on no mother should ever have to lose their child or their parent. It really reminds me of the Two Towers with Theoden, in that I think it's an extended scene where he's talking about no parent should have to bury their child. Same type of vibes. But obviously Catelyn's going to be thinking more on, was there some other woman that Hoster was involved in? Is that why he's thinking of, a child? And she's going to figure that out. Like, that's the mystery of this chapter for Catelyn, is figuring out who this Tansy is, and she's going to realize pretty quickly that it is Lysa. Catelyn questions Hoster about Tansy, asking who she is and if she still lives. He says the woman is dead and speaks as if to comfort her, mentioning she will have other children. Catelyn is confused, unsure whether he's speaking to her or someone else from the past. He continues rambling about being a good wife and bearing true-born sons, clearly lost in memory and pain. Now, what this is supposed to represent is the idea that Lysa ended up getting pregnant because of Littlefinger, because the two slept together. Now, Littlefinger believed that was Catelyn. That's a lot of the reasons why I think he spreads the rumor of taking Catelyn's maidenhead. And so then that had a whole catapulting effect, because now Lysa has become pregnant out of wedlock. Real big no-no at this, world, and in that time period, medieval times. And so what ended up happening is Lysa had to get like an abortion, and then she was married off to Jon Arryn to seal that relationship. And for Jon Arryn, it made sense because that was now provable that she was fertile, or somebody that needed heirs. Now, we're gonna circle back to this because Catelyn's gonna put all the pieces together, but I kind of wanted to lay it out for you guys that maybe you didn't understand this the first time you read it or whatnot. Just kind of throw it all out there instead of the vague dialogue that we get here from George, obviously because he wants it to be a mystery. At this point, Hoster starts coughing and fits, bringing up blood, and he clutches her hand before collapsing in agony. Maester Vyman arrives, giving him milk of the poppy and eases him back into sleep, as Catelyn asks the Maester about this Tansy, who is this person. But he does not recognize the name, and he suggests it might be a common name among small folk, and recalls a woman who came to the castle long ago. Now, he specifically says that it would be that this is like something the common people would call their daughters or their children. And that is very interesting because we know Catelyn had the nickname of Cat, and it would appear Lysa had the nickname of Tansy. Now, that's not something that Catelyn has put together yet, but it's supposed to be a wink to the audience. Oh, he's talking about Lysa. At this point, Catelyn then corrects him, saying this woman that Vyman was remembering is not actually that person. That person was named Violet, as that gets us into page 30. The Maester then apologizes, but explains he is only allowed to speak with her as duty requires, per Sir Desmond's orders. Catelyn accepts this, understanding she has given them little reason to trust her. She reflects that for now, she is removed from the war, even if only briefly. Now, in reality, Catelyn is basically going to be removed from the war. She, after this point, doesn't really have much power or even influence. A lot of the mistakes now are going to come down to just Robb and the mistakes he's made, like marrying Jane Westerling, killing Lord Karstark. Catelyn's role in the war effectively is over at this point. So in a lot of ways, yes, she will just be a passenger for the rest of this story until it meets its really terrible end for her. She returns to the balcony, watching the river and hoping not to see a sail, which would indicate that Jaime has been captured and that Brienne, maybe at this point, has succeeded. She watches all day and into the night despite exhaustion. A raven then arrives at Riverrun, reminding her of past messages that brought terrible news. Like, in the last book, her last chapter, the news of her son's death. And this also sparks curiosity because it's going to be bringing news of Robb or the North or King's Landing, anything like that, or even what maybe happened to Jaime and Brienne on the road. Maester Vyman then returns later, bringing food and tending to Lord Hoster. He reports that no one named Tansy has ever served at Riverrun, according to Eutherdus. Because we're doing a Catelyn chapter, Rhea wanted to appear, so she's being real wiggly right now, but she did want to make an appearance. Catelyn anxiously asks if there's news of Jaime, fearing he may have been recaptured or killed, but the Maester says there's no news of Jaime. And he's kind of not wanting to actually tell her what the news is, but Catelyn is going to press she wants to know. She presses further, worrying about Edmure or Robb. Reluctantly, the Maester reveals that Tywin Lannister has left the Riverlands and the Fords are quiet. And this is obviously indicating that Tywin has gone to King's Landing, the Battle of the Blackwater, and I really do like that George does this thing where news is not instant. This is not the internet. We don't know everything that's happening all at once, and that's one thing that I really like about George's world, is that, we still have to build up the mystery of, well, where did Tywin go, even if us, the audience, know. The characters don't. Catelyn asks about the Raven's message, sensing he is withholding something. He confirms it brought news from Robb, but hesitates. Realizing something is wrong, she demands the truth and fears for her son's life. The Maester finally admits that Robb was wounded while taking the crag, though he claims it is not serious and that Robb expects to return soon. And this is still going to worry a mother, of course. I mean, you don't know if this injury could get infected. It could be worse than maybe it's being reported as. Either way, it's something that you probably should be worried about to some extent. And we also know, because of Robb getting this injury, it's going to cause a much bigger problem. As we get into page 31, Catelyn presses for details about Robb's wound, but the Maester refuses to say more, bound by orders. He leaves quickly and she is left alone with her father. Lord Hoster lies in a drugged sleep, murmuring apologies in the name Tansy, along with the talk of blood. His words unsettle her deeply, though she cannot yet understand their meaning. That night she sleeps poorly, haunted by the thoughts of her lost children. It's really just Catelyn still trying to figure out the mystery. This chapter kind of reminds me a lot of the way Game of Thrones is structured, where in that first book you have a lot of these like mini mysteries in a chapter. This one kind of reminds me of like some of maybe Ned's chapters in that first book. But overall, Catelyn still just hasn't pieced it all together. Catelyn wakes early, fixated on her father's strange words about sweet babes and trueborns. She wonders if he fathered a bastard with this woman Tansy, though she struggles to believe it. She considers instead that Tansy might relate to Lysa, recalling how her father sometimes confuses them. And this is the thing, Catelyn has put it together. Catelyn can be very intelligent when it's not something directly involving her. I think that's the key. Like something involving Lysa and Hoster, she's able to put it together quite quickly. Like this only took her a little bit of like, I got a little bit of sleep. Now I get what's happening here. Memories surface of Lysa's miscarriage and her earlier joy at believing she was pregnant. Because Lysa had been pregnant quite a few times but had a lot of miscarriages. But the thing that doesn't add up for Catelyn is that none of those would have happened with Hoster around. Hoster would not have been there to, comfort her when she had a miscarriage, because these either happened in the Vale or at King's Landing. Both Hoster was not at. So if it is relating to Lysa, it had to be before she married Jon Arryn. She recalls Lysa's excitement about their future sons, followed by her sudden despair when her bleeding began. A memory of giving baby Robb to Lysa returns, and how Lysa broke into tears and fled. These memories deepen Catelyn's unease, hinting that something more painful and hidden lies behind her father's words. And Catelyn's starting to figure it all out, but for Lysa, this chapter does so much to characterize her. One thing that book one, we don't really fully understand Lysa as a character. We don't necessarily understand why she's doing the things that she does. And in a lot of ways, Lysa as a character is the mystery of the first three books, especially with why everything started, Littlefinger's plotline, Catelyn's plotline as well. It all links back to Lysa. And so the story in this chapter specifically is about starting to peel that back. Because especially, we're not going to get a lot of Lysa until much later in this book, but George does this well throughout all three of the books, where he'll present something much earlier on that has a huge payoff way later. Like, for instance, think about the poison that's going to be used on Joffrey, we believe. That gets introduced in the first chapter of A Clash of Kings, but it has that natural payoff later on. But it's just what makes George's writing so amazing. As we get into page 32, Catelyn begins to piece together the truth, realizing Lysa may have lost a child before her marriage. She recalls how hastily Lysa was wed to Jon Arryn and an aging lord desperate for an heir. The match now seems less about love and more about alliance and fertility. Filled with dread, Catelyn goes to her father and confronts the realization of what he had done. And this has to be interesting because when you're looking at it from the outside, looking in, you have Lysa, who's a much younger woman, married to an older man. And you have to think about it from this perspective is it's a marriage alliance. Catelyn was supposed to marry Brandon Stark. That then got moved to Ned to try and, unify those two great houses. So obviously Hoster marrying off Lysa, you have to think about it from this perspective that Lysa should be a fairly hot commodity, given it's a tie to House Tully. She's still very young. It's not like, say, maybe Arianne for the Martells, where she's like the oldest daughter, for instance, but it's still, she should have a lot of offers. So the fact that she marries Jon Arryn, somebody that's older, but then you start to peel the layers back. Jon Arryn needs an heir. And the baggage that Lysa has with, having a child with somebody else, but then it looks like it probably got aborted. So it's very interesting. Like that whole fundamental relationship and alliances of Robert's Rebellion are really interesting. And this is one thing I wonder about the play, because I don't know how much we're going to get if George actually allows them to touch on some of this stuff. Again, I'm not exactly sure how far they're going to get, but this is the stuff that'd be really cool to see how is working behind the scenes. She concludes that Hoster forced Lysa into the marriage to secure Tully's support for the rebellion. This explains Lysa's unhappy, loveless marriage and her need for warmth that Jon Arryn could not give. The next day, Catelyn writes a letter to Lysa telling her of Bran and Rickon's deaths and their father's failing state. She explains that Hoster is haunted by guilt over what he did to Lysa and may be seeking forgiveness. Catelyn urges Lysa to come to Riverrun, or at the very least send a message that she can read to Hoster. The problem is, all of this is happening a little too late. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be reiterated through Catelyn's story is she's catching on to things a little too late in terms of, she was lied to by Littlefinger about the dagger and everything going on. Little too late to that, right? Things have already been set in motion. Or things like Lysa and understanding why she maybe doesn't want to come and support Riverrun because of Hoster and the trauma there. There's a lot of that in this story, and especially with Catelyn's journey, as in a lot of ways, like I've said multiple times, the Red Wedding has already really begun. There is no stopping it now because of the mistakes that have been made, especially with Robb marrying Jane Westerling. Catelyn knows that likely there's not going to be a chance for Lysa to get to Riverrun or for a message to get to the Eyrie and back, but still, she holds on to hope that the Tully strength might keep Hoster alive for at least Lysa to send a message back. Afterwards, Catelyn goes to the Sept and lights candles for her father, for wisdom, and for Lysa and their lost child, as we get into page 33. While sitting with her father, Catelyn hears trumpets shouting and the sounds of riding riders. At first, Catelyn believed this to be Sir Robin returning as she goes to the balcony but sees nothing on the river, so it couldn't be him. But climbing to the roof, she discovers riders approaching the main gate under Tully banners. She feels relief upon realizing it is Edmure returning, because regardless of what Catelyn's done and the treason she's done, it's still good to see that her brother has survived the battles with the Lannisters. Remember, the way we ended out the last book is Edmure was defending Riverrun, and he had these battles against Tywin in the Mountain and Adam Marbrand. The castle fills with noise as families reunite and ravens are sent out with news, as Catelyn preps herself for Edmure's reaction, waiting anxiously. When he arrives, he looks worn and strained despite his victory. One thing I like that George does here is that even though Edmure won this battle, he won this victory, it's not a reflection on that. He doesn't look happy. He doesn't look like, they're winning the war. He looks like somebody beaten down. And obviously knowing the news that he does, that the Lannisters beat the Baratheons and the state of the South, he knows it's not looking good. Edmure then tells her he has repelled Tywin and the other Lannister forces, but then reveals that Stannis has been defeated at King's Landing, his fleet destroyed, and army scattered. Though this is bad news, Catelyn feels a little sympathy for Stannis after what she witnessed with Renly's death. But Edmure explains the broader consequences to her. The Tyrells and Dorne have joined Joffrey for now, strengthening the Lannisters. And this is a huge blow. I mean, this is terrible news for Robb, because already Robb was fighting an uphill battle with the Lannisters because they had more men than he did. But there was a lot of hope because the Lannisters were spread very thin. They had the Baratheon brothers, they had Robb and the Starks and the River Lords. Tywin had no reason to win this war at this point. But because of how things have shaken out, because of Renly's death, because of Edmure's action, which, again, for Edmure, he didn't know that that was even possible. That because he repels Tywin, that's going to, be able to defeat Stannis at the Blackwater. And then you have to also remember, all of Tyrion's actions bought enough time for Stannis to lose that battle for Tywin to get there. This is a huge blow, though. If you're anybody in Robb's campaign at this point, this should be the realization the war is over. In terms of actually being able to defeat the Lannisters, this is the point from no return. And especially as things get worse with the Karstarks and the Freys abandoning Robb's cause. At this point, though, the war is over. And that's why I talked about with the Clash of Kings, it's so interesting because in a lot of ways, it's like the rise and the fall of Robb, where at the beginning of the book, he's winning all these victories in the West, but by the end of the book, I mean, it's just a complete shit show for his campaign. His war is over, and he hasn't even lost a battle. Edmure, who is frustrated and angry, he confronts Catelyn, accusing her having no right to free Jaime. And as we get into page 34, Catelyn calmly insists she acted out of a mother's right despite the political consequences. And I want to say this on Edmure's behalf. He's totally right. Catelyn had no right to ever try and do anything like that, to free Jaime. And here's the other part. Even if Robb was to say, bend the knee. Let's say Robb, seeing the situation, he realizes the war is over. He's going to give up his crown. I don't know if that's even possible at this point, but let's say he did that. Having Jaime as a piece really works in his benefit. I think there's a situation where Tywin would accept Robb to basically come under peace again, come under the Seven Kingdoms, if he has Jaime. But without Jaime, you have nothing. Robb at this point has no brokering chips. He is completely at the mercy of the Tyrell, Dornish, and Lannister alliance. Edmure rejects Catelyn's explanation, arguing Jaime was Robb's prisoner and his responsibility to guard. She defends Brienne, trusting her oath to deliver Jaime and return her daughters. As Edmure dismisses this, saying Cersei would never agree to such terms. Catelyn argues it was Tyrion's promise which was the key, along with Jaime's sworn oath. Edmure counters that Jaime's word is worthless and claims Tyrion may already be dead because of the Battle of the Blackwater and the injury he has sustained. And also remember, they are just getting the loose news. They don't know what Tyrion's medical condition is. Us, the audience, we know he's still alive, but obviously Edmure's not going to. And when you think about that for a second, Catelyn just placed a lot of risk on this, because even think about the idea of when she releases Jaime. She releases Jaime right before the Battle of the Blackwater, so right before King's Landing is about to be attacked. She also sent out Jaime into the situation that the Lannisters might not even be on the throne. You might be just sending Jaime to Stannis. So, again, there was a lot of flaws in Catelyn's plan, and obviously it wasn't a logical plan. It was very much motivated by emotion, and, Catelyn is not really going to get a good ending because of those decisions. This news obviously shakes Catelyn, as her hopes depended on Tyrion honoring the agreement, but Edmure reveals he has sent ravens to have Jaime recaptured, offering a reward. He specifically sent word to Roose Bolton, knowing the route to King's Landing passes near Harrenhal. Catelyn is horrified, realizing this puts Brienne and Jaime in grave danger. Edmure insists he concealed her involvement, framing it as Jaime's escape. Now, I'll say this, though, it kind of makes Edmure look incompetent by saying this, saying that, oh, somehow Jaime just escaped. It doesn't look good on him, but obviously he's trying to spare his sister, which I think is a great move. Edmure is a very good guy. He's a very good person overall. And I think Edmure is completely right on what he's trying to do. Their best chance for trying to somehow rekindle this situation is getting Jaime back. And the problem is, it would have worked if Roose was loyal to Robb. It would have worked. Roose did actually end up capturing Jaime, but Roose played them definitely really badly. And there's no real reason, and this is the thing with Catelyn, is obviously Catelyn's holding on to any hope of getting her daughters back. But she's also got to realize, okay, now, if the thing is that Tyrion might die, or is dead at this point, and the people in charge of King's Landing are Joffrey, Cersei, and Tywin, like, what are the odds they actually honor this deal that was done while Jaime had a sword to his throat or his chest in a dungeon? Like, it just doesn't look good on Catelyn, and Edmure, I think, is in the complete right in this situation. Catelyn then realizes this destroys any chance of exchanging Jaime for her daughters. She despairs that her daughters may now be lost to her forever. Believing Edmure has ruined everything, she breaks down emotionally. She dismisses him, wanting only to be left alone with her grief and exhaustion. And she's, I think, totally wrong to blame Edmure here. Like, yes, the way Edmure has now framed it, it looks like, oh, this was not an exchange of prisoners or anything like that. But already it wasn't, because the normal way you would exchange prisoners is there'd be communication from both sides. You would set up, where are we going to exchange these prisoners? And there'd be like an honor guard there wouldn't just be like Brienne and Cleo's Frey. So obviously it already didn't look great. And also you're working on the premise that, oh, when Jaime is returned, like what's stopping them from cutting down Brienne and just, saying, Jaime's back. So it just didn't make a whole lot of sense overall. And Catelyn is taking out her frustration and her despair and grief on Edmure, and she shouldn't do that, right? But this is very normal. The idea that Catelyn's holding on to a hope of getting her daughters back has clouded her judgment. It's clouded what's rational. And the idea is, even going all the way back to the last book, the hope of getting her daughters back was pretty thin. Arya hasn't been heard of. For all we know, and what Rob's going to bring up to her in this book, is that Arya is dead. Nobody knows where she is. Not even Varys can find her. Likely she is dead. We know that not to be the case, but based on let's just zoom out and say we didn't know Arya's point of view was a thing, she likely would be dead. And Sansa, she's at the complete mercy of the Lannisters. The only way you get Sansa back at this point is maybe if you bend the knee at this point, so Robb would have to give up his crown and trade Jaime for Sansa. And even at that point, if you're the Lannisters, you have every right to go, we're going to keep Sansa. This is going to be a ward. If you screw up, Sansa's going to get beheaded. That's what I would be thinking if I was the Lannisters. It's the same thing with the Greyjoy Rebellion. Why is it any different here? And so at this point, when you really look at that, the actual hope of ever getting Sansa back is very low. So it's kind of just Catelyn clinging on to something that's, at this point, not very likely or close to impossible. So that is Catelyn 1. Again, I don't think it's a bad chapter at all. I want to really point that out. I think it's a mid-chapter considering who the point of view is. Catelyn, to me, is my favorite point of view, especially the first 3 books. And her first chapter, it's getting the ball rolling while having a nice little mini mystery that's going to have a payoff at the very end of the book or close to the end of the book. And, it's a kind of a catch-up chapter. It's, Catelyn is realizing what happened at the Battle of the Blackwater. It's stuff we all kind of know, but the characters need to, be caught up, and that makes sense. But overall, I do think of the first 3 chapters, I think I have this one rated 3rd. I think I obviously have Jaime's chapter higher than this. I'm not sure about Chet's chapter to open the book. I think it's either on par with this chapter or a little higher. I can't remember. But that'll get us to Arya 1, A Storm of Swords. So we're really knocking out of the park all of the Riverland chapters or POVs right off the bat. But again, I really enjoy doing these chapter rereads. And if you enjoy them, feel free to subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. And these will always be out every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Time, or U.S. Central Time, I should say. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.